I never imagined that the daughter I raised with such devotion would one day hire someone to replace me. But there I was, 73 years old, standing on my own front porch, watching a stranger unlock my door with keys that used to be mine. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. I woke at 6, made my coffee, and settled into my routine of tending to the small garden behind my modest home in Riverside. The tomatoes were coming along nicely, and the marigolds I had planted in memory of my late husband Harold were blooming in brilliant orange clusters. It was therapeutic work, this nurturing of growing things, something that had sustained me through the loneliest years since Harold passed 5 years ago. My daughter Catherine had been increasingly insistent about my need for help. Not the kind of help I actually wanted, like someone to drive me to doctor appointments or help with heavy grocery bags. No, Catherine had decided I needed supervision. She had taken it upon herself to hire Mrs. Henley, a stern woman in her 50s who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks earlier, when Catherine announced during one of her brief, duty-bound visits that she had found the perfect solution to what she called my situation. She never specified exactly what my situation was, but her tone suggested it was both urgent and embarrassing. Catherine had always possessed this talent for making me feel like a problem that needed solving, even when I was managing perfectly well on my own. Mrs. Henley arrived the following Monday with a suitcase and an air of ownership that immediately set my teeth on edge. She surveyed my home with disapproving eyes, making notes in a small spiral notebook that she pulled from her sensible handbag. She criticized my morning routine, declared my housekeeping inadequate, and informed me that she would be implementing a new schedule designed to keep me safe and healthy. Within days, Mrs. Henley had rearranged my kitchen to her specifications, claiming my arrangement was inefficient and potentially dangerous. She moved my favorite coffee mug to a cabinet I could barely reach, and relocated my reading glasses to places I would never think to look. When I protested, she smiled with practiced patience and explained that these changes were for my own good. The woman had an uncanny ability to make me feel foolish for the smallest things. She would watch me water my plants with barely concealed exasperation, eventually taking the watering can from my hands with a sigh that suggested I was incapable of even this simple task. She monitored my telephone conversations, hovering nearby with the pretense of dusting furniture that was already clean. When I mentioned this to Catherine during her weekly check-in call, my daughter dismissed my concerns with her usual efficiency. Catherine had always been a practical child. Even as a toddler, she organized her toys by color and size, and grew frustrated when other children disrupted her careful arrangements. As an adult, she had channeled this trait into a successful career in project management, approaching every aspect of life with spreadsheets and timelines. I had been proud of her accomplishments, even when they came at the cost of warmth in our relationship. But somewhere along the way, I had become another item on Catherine's to-do list, a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished. She scheduled our interactions with the same clinical detachment she brought to her work projects. Our conversations followed predictable scripts, with Catherine inquiring about my health, my medications, and my compliance with Mrs. Henley's routines. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in late September. I had been looking forward to my weekly visit from my neighbor's granddaughter Emma, a sweet 12-year-old who enjoyed hearing stories about the old days. Emma was one of the few people who still sought out my company purely for the joy of it, and our conversations reminded me that I still had something valuable to offer the world. Mrs. Henley had been particularly overbearing that morning, insisting that I was not dressed appropriately for company, and forcing me to change into what she deemed more suitable attire. She hovered during Emma's visit, interrupting our conversation to remind me to take my afternoon medications and to suggest that perhaps I was getting too excited for someone my age. After Emma left, clearly uncomfortable with Mrs. L, Henley's intrusive presence, I attempted to address the situation directly. I told Henley that I appreciated her concern but felt she was overstepping appropriate boundaries. Her response was swift and devastating. She informed me that Catherine had given her full authority to make decisions about my daily activities, and that any resistance on my part would be reported as a sign of cognitive decline. The cruelty of it took my breath away. This stranger was threatening to brand me as mentally incompetent, simply because I dared to assert some control over my own life. Worse still, she was wielding my own daughter's authority as the weapon to silence me. That evening I called Catherine to discuss what had happened. I explained calmly that Mrs. Henley's approach was making me miserable, and asked if we could perhaps find someone who would respect my autonomy while still providing the assistance Catherine felt I needed. My daughter's response shattered something fundamental inside me. She sighed with the weary patience of someone dealing with a difficult client and explained that Mrs. Henley came highly recommended for dealing with elderly individuals who were resistant to help. Catherine used clinical language to describe my behavior, referring to my desire for independence as stubbornness, and my discomfort with Mrs. Henley's methods as an inability to accept necessary changes. The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which Catherine had come to view me as incompetent. She had apparently been discussing my private affairs with Mrs. Henley in detail, sharing information about my finances, my health conditions, and even my emotional state following Harold's death. They had developed strategies for managing my resistance, treating me like a child who needed to be tricked into compliance. When I expressed hurt at this betrayal of trust, Catherine's patience finally wore thin. She informed me that she was tired of worrying about me and that Mrs. Henley provided her with peace of mind. She suggested that my emotional reaction to the situation was proof that the arrangement was necessary, as a rational person would be grateful for such dedicated care. The phone call ended with Catherine telling me that she expected me to cooperate fully with Mrs. Henley's instructions, and that any further complaints would force her to consider more drastic measures. The implication was clear: comply or face the possibility of being moved to a facility where my choices would be even more limited. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I had shared with Harold for 38 years. The house felt different now, no longer a sanctuary but a prison where my every move was monitored and judged. I thought about the woman I used to be, someone who had raised a family, managed a household through lean times, and supported her husband through his final illness with strength and grace. The next morning brought a moment of clarity that would change everything. Mrs. Henley was in my kitchen, preparing what she called a proper breakfast while criticizing my usual toast and jam as nutritionally inadequate. She had thrown away my favorite jam, declaring it too sugary for someone my age, and replaced it with a sugar-free alternative that tasted like disappointment. As I watched her move through my space with proprietary confidence, I realized that I had been approaching this situation entirely wrong. I had been trying to negotiate with people who had already decided I was incapable of making decisions for myself. I had been seeking compromise with individuals who viewed my preferences as obstacles to be overcome, rather than valid choices to be respected. The decision that formed in my mind was both terrifying and liberating. I would not continue to live as a prisoner in my own home, subjected to the whims of a woman who treated me like a wayward child. I would not accept my daughter's determination to manage me like a problematic project, rather than love me as her mother. Later that morning, while Mrs. Henley was on one of her mysterious errands, I began making phone calls. I started with my doctor, Dr. Martinez, who had been caring for me for over a decade. I explained the situation and asked for a comprehensive evaluation to document my mental and physical capabilities. He was appalled to learn how my concerns had been dismissed and immediately scheduled an appointment for the following day. My next call was to my lawyer, Robert Steinberg, who had handled Harold's estate and our various legal needs over the years. Robert listened with growing concern as I described the restrictions being placed on my daily life and Catherine's threats about more drastic measures. He explained my rights as an elderly person and discussed options for protecting my autonomy. The most difficult call was to my son Michael, Catherine's younger brother, who lived 3 states away with his own family. Michael had always been the more emotionally available of my 2 children, but geography and his busy life as a high school teacher had limited our contact to holidays and special occasions. I had hesitated to burden him with my problems, but I realized that isolation was exactly what Catherine and Mrs. Problems, Henley, were counting on. Michael was shocked to learn about the situation. He had been under the impression that Mrs. Henley was simply helping with household tasks and providing companionship. Catherine had apparently painted a very different picture for him, suggesting that I was declining more rapidly than I actually was, and that professional care was becoming essential for my safety. Over the next few days, I documented everything. I kept detailed notes about Mrs. Henley's behavior, her restrictions on my activities, and the ways she consistently undermined my confidence and autonomy. I photographed the changes she had made to my home without my consent and saved voicemails from Catherine that demonstrated her dismissive attitude toward my concerns. Dr. Martinez's evaluation was thorough and vindicated my position completely. He found me to be in excellent mental health for my age, with no signs of cognitive decline or impairment. His written report specifically noted my ability to make informed decisions about my care and living situation. Armed with this documentation, I felt ready to take the next step. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henley had noticed my increased activity and began reporting back to Catherine with growing alarm. She characterized my doctor visit as secretive and suspicious, suggesting that I was becoming paranoid and possibly dangerous to myself. When Catherine called to confront me about my behavior, I was ready for her. I informed my daughter that I had decided to terminate Mrs. Henley's employment immediately, and that I would be resuming full control over my household and personal affairs. Catherine's reaction was predictably explosive. She accused me of being irrational and stubborn, threatening once again to pursue guardianship proceedings if I continued on this path. But something had changed in me during those days of careful planning and documentation. I no longer felt like the confused, helpless woman Catherine and Mrs. Henley had tried to convince me I was. I had taken concrete steps to assess my capabilities and protect my rights, proving to myself that I was still perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. When Catherine arrived at my house the next day, with Mrs. Henley in tow, expecting to force a confrontation that would demonstrate my incompetence, she instead found me calm, prepared, and supported by both my doctor's evaluation and my lawyer's presence. Robert had agreed to attend the meeting to ensure that my wishes were clearly understood and legally documented. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time in years, I spoke to Catherine not as a supplicant seeking her approval, but as her mother demanding her respect. I presented the medical evidence of my competence, explained the legal protections available to me, and made it clear that I would not tolerate further attempts to undermine my autonomy. Mrs. Henley's presence became increasingly uncomfortable as it became obvious that her authority was not as absolute as she had believed. When she attempted to interject with comments about my supposed limitations, Robert firmly redirected the conversation back to documented facts rather than subjective opinions. Catherine's initial anger gradually gave way to a kind of confused hurt. She seemed genuinely bewildered by my transformation from compliant victim to assertive advocate for my own interests. She had become so accustomed to viewing me as incompetent that my demonstration of capability challenged her entire understanding of our relationship. The meeting ended with Mrs. Henley's immediate dismissal and a clear agreement about the boundaries of Catherine's involvement in my life going forward. I acknowledged her love and concern while making it unmistakable that I would not accept control disguised as care. The weeks that followed were challenging in ways I had not anticipated. Catherine withdrew almost completely, apparently unable to reconcile her image of me as a helpless, elderly woman with the reality of my continued competence. Our conversations became stilted and infrequent, filled with the awkwardness of two people trying to navigate a relationship that had been fundamentally altered. But there were also unexpected joys in reclaiming my independence. My home felt like my own again, arranged according to my preferences and filled with the rhythms of my choosing. I resumed my friendship with Emma, whose visits became even more precious after the interruption. I reconnected with old friends who had gradually been discouraged by Mrs. Henley's interference. Michael made a special trip to visit, bringing his teenage daughter Sarah with him. Sarah was fascinated by her grandmother's story of standing up for herself and declared it inspirational. Through her eyes, I began to see my actions, not as a family conflict, but as a victory for dignity and self-determination. The garden behind my house flourished that fall, producing the best tomato harvest I had enjoyed in years. As I worked among the plants, I reflected on the parallels between tending a garden and tending to one's own life. Both required attention, patience, and the wisdom to know when to nurture and when to prune away what was no longer healthy. Gradually, Catherine and I began to find a new equilibrium. She continued to call weekly, but our conversations slowly shifted from management to genuine connection. She shared updates about her work and asked about my activities, without the underlying assumption that I needed supervision. It was not the warm, easy relationship I had once hoped for, but it was honest and respectful. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the difference between aging and surrendering. I had nearly allowed others to convince me that my years automatically disqualified me from making my own decisions. I had almost accepted that being elderly meant accepting whatever arrangements others deemed appropriate, regardless of my own preferences or capabilities. Instead, I learned that advocacy for oneself becomes more important, not less, as we age. The assumption that elderly people should gratefully accept whatever care is offered can become a trap that robs us of agency and dignity. True care respects the person being cared for, honoring their preferences, and involving them in decisions about their own lives. Today, as I sit in my garden watching the sunset paint my little corner of the world in shades of gold and crimson, I feel a deep satisfaction that has nothing to do with age or circumstance. I feel the contentment that comes from knowing I fought for my right to remain myself, even when those closest to me had decided that self was no longer worth preserving. The tomatoes are ripening again, and Emma will be by tomorrow to help me decide which ones are ready for picking. Catherine called yesterday to ask about my plans for Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, the question felt like an invitation rather than an assessment of my capabilities. Michael is bringing his family for a visit next month, and Sarah wants to interview me about my experiences for a school project on women's rights. I am still the same woman who raised 2 children, buried a beloved husband, and tended this garden through countless seasons. The difference is that now everyone else knows it too. Sometimes, the most radical act an elderly person can commit is simply refusing to disappear into the convenient fiction of incompetence that others construct around them. The evening air carries the scent of marigolds and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. I am 73 years old, and I am exactly where I choose to be.